very special guest today, Maykl Konnorun. He is a very dear friend now who did this exhibition together. It's very hard work to bring all these amazing artworks to Baku. And he's the artistic director of Rhizome, which is a very important organization based in New York that is dedicated to research and promotion of digital art practices and post-internet art. And he will be talking to us about this new media in art and his favorite websites and what artistic approaches one can have on the internet. And the good thing is that this is recorded, so whoever is not here, we will be streaming it on our website. So you will have larger audiences once this is done. Thank you very much and welcome.
Hi everybody. Thank you for coming on Holiday Thursday. Yes, so this is where I work, rhizome.org. It's a website that was founded in 1996. I like to make the very tired joke that in internet years, that makes us older than the Met Museum, which is New York's sort of most vaunted institution. Because for a kind of online nonprofit to exist for almost 20 years means that we've experienced a lot of sort of technological history and watched artistic practices change around that structure over time. So right now on rhizome.org, we have a digital painting exhibition in which each week we show a new artist working with digital painting on our front page. And this week we have a work by Andre Uhazi. And Andre has made this sort of massive digital painting, which is sort of like very auspicious because it's actually inspired in a sense by the landscape of sort of this region, more so maybe north of Baku. But the reason that Andre is painting this region is because he's a video game fanatic and he's been playing the game, I think it's called Total War. It's set in the late Roman Empire, and apparently they have a lot of really good scenes involving the Sarmatian tribes, who were like, in the late Roman Empire, a group of people who were known for having women warriors and stuff, so it's a very, very cool story. But Andre is working on the computer in Photoshop, and he is painting these sort of like massively detailed canvases that you have to kind of like zoom and pan around to see completely. I think I'm going to let that load and come back to it. Will it load in the background? Okay, we'll come back there in a sec. Rhizome since 2003 has been based at the New Museum. Because we're a very sort of small group of people, we have really experienced a lot of different versions of the organization over time. But being based at the New Museum since 2003 gave Rhizome's area of activity, which tends to be like this sort of fringe digital art thing, more of an institutional sort of stamp of approval somehow. So that's been, for 12 years we've been working with them, and until last September I was working in this white building on the left, and now I work in the building next door to it. This is in the new Rhizome office is part of this sort of shared workspace that the New Museum set up. So we're now like next to tech companies and designers, and all working in this sort of shared workspace. And it's actually really fun and exciting because there's a lot of different people coming through all the time, and it's been really cool. So we're part of a museum, but we're not really like exactly within the museum. And we're also part of this other kind of community which is connected to the museum and part of New York's sort of cultural landscape. We like to do sort of like fun things in New York, like our surfing competition last year, which we held at Rockaway Beach Surf Club, which was an internet surfing competition held in an ocean surfing environment, which was really fun. Okay. So what I want to talk to you today about is just like a few sort of schematic categories of like practice in net art, and then look at some examples of work. So I'm going to give you these different terms, and we're going to talk about like how artists have employed them over time. But I'm going to start with this one because a lot of artists that have used the internet approach it kind of as a medium. They think of the internet as material, something that they can work with and shape to give a visual experience. And so sometimes at Ryzen we talk about those kinds of artists using the term formalism, like they're thinking about the formal aspects of the internet, just as people might think about the formal aspects of a painting. And they also sometimes fall under the umbrella of glitch, because when you approach internet as medium, sometimes the best way to understand it is to break it and to like make things work a little bit messed up so that you can sort of see the material of it in a different way. Formalism and glitch was especially sort of prevalent for artists that were working in the mid-90s. As you guys probably know, the web is not that old. The concept was invented in 1989, the same year, of course, of other historical events that have made that now seem like a watershed in history. But really, people didn't start using the web till 1993, which is when the first commercial web browser was released. And around that time, artists began to get very interested in this new space. They saw it as a way to make work outside of institutions. They saw it as a way to connect with peers around the world. And yeah, they were just very excited by the properties of this, what they saw as a new medium. So really in that period, sort of like right around 1995, there was a group of people that really came together around the idea of being net artists. Many of them were actually sort of like focused in former Soviet areas. I think there was a great deal of excitement in the 90s about the potential for the web in the post-Soviet world because of this newfound connection with many different places around the world. So the first artist I'll show you is an artist from Moscow named Alexei Shulgin. And Alexei is like he's a really funny guy. He really, I didn't do that right. Alexei was always really excited about the web as this very populist medium. He always really liked the idea of like people working together to make art. And in 1997, one of his projects was that he ran this competition called Form Art. And the concept was that people would create artworks on the web using only the sort of default elements of a web browser. So if you click on like one of these will link you to this page. Oh. And so you can recognize the visual elements here as like, if you're booking a flight, you would see menus like this or something. These are all really like elements that your browser knows how to render. It knows how to make a menu. And his concept was that people should use these default elements to make animations and images and different things. Like a smiley face. Oh, I don't know what I did. Excuse me. So this work is a work that fits into the category of formalism in a sense because it's sort of like taking these building blocks of the browser as a material and building it up again into a different kind of experience. And in doing so, it sort of calls attention to things which on the web really quickly become invisible. Like as you're browsing, you don't really notice necessarily the button design on a travel website. But actually those things are sort of subtly informing our everyday experience so much. So there's an element of the work which is like about sort of bringing things into focus, which are otherwise kind of hard to see. But it also fits into sort of like other ways of thinking about the net, in particular because of the collaborative dimension, the fact that it was this open call and people could participate. Excuse me. So, has anyone here come across the work of the artist Jodi, Jodi? They're really, I don't know if, no one ever really gives a talk about net art without talking about Jody. You guys know Jody. So they're an artist duo that came together in 1995 working on the web. And actually, I'm going to show you a different work before we look at this, because so this is Jody's first work on the internet. Many W's, yeah. www.jody.org. And the story about it is really funny, but like back in the early days of the web, people would go to a page like this and they would be like, oh, this person, they have a mistake in their HTML code. There's some sort of mistake here. I need to tell them, I need to look at their code and tell them what's wrong, and then they can fix it. So so that person would be like, I'm going to look at the source code of this page so I can see where their mistake is. And they'd look back here and they would see that the source code is actually a picture of a nuclear missile, nuclear bomb. And so what I just did is, this is the code that renders the page. You can do this for any page on the web, of course. They all have text which underlies them. But what's interesting about the page is that, you know, normally the stuff that's like images and that you see is on the sort of browser rendered side. But here we have an artwork which is only visible when you look at the kind of code layer of the web. This kind of drawing, so this is all text that's arranged in a pattern to make an image, which was a kind of drawing that was very popular on the early web, especially because it was a way that you could send an image with very little bandwidth. So like this image over here that I'm downloading, it's still going, it's 70 megabytes. That's like the worst case example for like how long it would take to send an image online. Whereas something like this, it's like so small, even if you were on a telephone line with a terrible connection, it would just be it's like a really quick way to send. So people in the early days of the web, and in the 80s even, would use these kinds of images as a way to like quickly draw on the computer. So Jody's sort of like concept was taking that and executing it as code. And we might talk about this a bit more in a minute. But it's sort of worth looking at like a more recent example by them. I think I have the link over here. Oh gosh. So this is a project they made on top of Google Earth and Google Maps, which uses the default elements of Google Maps, where people can like put a pin to note where there's a campsite, or a little coffee mug to denote the location of a coffee shop. And they've created a software that uses these little elements to make animations on top of Google Earth. And it cycles through many of them. You can choose up here. Oh, really? I wonder if it is because of our location. Yeah. Okay. I might show one more project, which I don't have queued up here, but we can find online really quick. Because Jody are artists that really like came to the web partly because they like they really hate like the kind of commercial art system, and so in a way their career has been like really important and influential to other artists, but they've never like had a great deal of sort of normal artist recognition in their work. In fact, many of those artists from the 90s have not. But the artist that I wanted to show you now is probably just important to kind of note as a reference point because his work has been so important in this discourse. But I often don't show it because I feel like I know it so well or something. But actually, I'm showing this because we were talking about it last night, Alexia. So this is a project by Corey Archangel, who is an artist from New York, and he grew up in Buffalo, New York, which is you know Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is a funny place because it's a small town upstate, a small city. It's kind of like it's known as like a dismal place in a way, but they have a really strong experimental art scene. And Corey grew up in Buffalo watching experimental video art on TV. And I think it's an interesting like example of the ways in which, you know, exposing kids to art can result in a... Is there translation happening? Should I be going slower? Sorry. Yeah, can kind of like yield unexpected dividends. So Super Mario Clouds is a project that Corey made, which came out of his work with a group called Beige. And I think it's... for this project, Corey hacked a Nintendo video game cartridge. And he changed the source code and put in a new chip so that when it was played in a Nintendo video game system, it would play just the clouds. You know, here's the YouTube version of it. Unavailable. This is on view right now at the Whitney Museum in New York as an installation. And I would sort of hesitate in a way to categorize this exactly as glitch art because he's not actually breaking the game so much as just modifying it to highlight visual elements. But there's a lot of ways that we can talk about this as a sort of example of a kind of moment when digital culture becomes sort of so much a part of a person's personal experience that they are, you know, that they are able to make very personal work in reference to existing digital media. Which I think differentiates it from the artists of the mid-90s who were, you know, more excited about a new medium. With Corey, we're looking at a medium that's kind of already been integrated into all parts of life or something. So formalism and glitch is sort of the most recognizable category of net art because this is the place where artists are really working with the material of code and the browser and those sorts of things. But an important aspect of the web in every sense is sort of the question of collaboration, which I brought up with regard to Alexei Shulgin. But a lot of the projects that have been the most important in the field of net art are projects that are not done by a single artist and are actually kind of ongoing groups of people that work together over time. And my favorite example of this is a group called Nasty Nets. Nasty Nets was what's called a surf club, and it existed, I can tell you because it's on the side here, from 2006 to 2012. It was a group of people, mostly I mean, I think they would all be considered net artists, but they weren't exactly like making art together. What they were doing was they created this group blog where they could all post cool stuff that they found or made, and then they would sometimes sort of respond to one another on it. So what have we got here? Wine isn't about drinking it. gif of an endlessly pouring wine bottle. It's like weird internet humor. The kind of stuff that I think you see more everywhere now. But maybe it is, yeah. But the people that were involved in this are all like, sort of still practicing as net artists. Here we have Carrie Altman, who is an artist that yeah, we're going to look at her work again in a moment. So, yeah, Nastinets was like a group of people that were like considering the internet often as like a source of found material and sharing it together. Oh, Constant Doulart. I mean, all these people are, it was sort of like this enormously generative community somehow. Here's a photo of a Palm Pilot. Oh, I think that this photo is shared because he liked the phrase "I know right" in his Palm Pilot's like standard responses. So this was, because this started in 2006, it was really before the real rise of social media. And this kind of thing has really continued on Facebook these days and other kinds of platforms. There's a lot of interesting like Facebook groups going on. Like this one is the Cool Freaks Wikipedia Club, which is like a group on Facebook for people finding like really weird shit on Wikipedia. There's another really good group about like the aesthetics of medical devices that a lot of artists are excited about. Yeah, so this kind of collaboration and sharing still is really crucial. Then there's performance. There's a way in which one could consider everything that happens online as a kind of performance. It's a familiar experience to the Instagram and Facebook users. You know, every status update is a kind of performance in some sense. And so it's not surprising that there's been a lot of intersection over time between performance art and net art. I'm going to show just a couple of examples of performance. This project has performative aspects. This is from 1996, and it's a project by Heath Bunting called Project X. And it was a project where he would walk around the city and write down URLs in chalk on the ground. And so actually the URL, which is the web address. So he would write this web address, irational.org/x. So the idea was that people would be walking around the city and they'd see this strange text on the ground. Then they'd go home, get on the web, and go to this page, and he'd have this survey for them to answer. And it would say, where did you see this chalked? Why do you think it was done? Who did it? And they would fill out their answers, and after they replied, they could see everybody else's answers too. Yeah, so Heath's work always had this sort of dimension of playing out in public space, even though it was about the web. And I think that's a really kind of interesting, it was like a really interesting concept to explore in that moment. Because today, it's become so much more evident how our cities and our experiences, which are like, you know, offline in many ways, are actually still structured by the internet. I think he was very early in recognizing that there was an interesting relationship between those kinds of places. But I think of this as performance because it's so much about like Heath kind of walking around the city and being like an artist who walks in the same tradition as people like Francis Elise or something now, maybe. And then, you know, a much more kind of recent example is this project by Amalia Ullman called Excellences and Perfections, in which she did a performance piece on her Instagram account over a period of 3 months, where she followed a fictional script that she had developed. It was based on American reality television, a specific program in which people go through an extreme makeover to become more beautiful, quote unquote, and to change their appearance. And so Amalia felt that the show had a kind of pattern where people would go on the show and they'd be really cute and excited, you know, and then they would like have some kind of like big city moment where they would like get into drugs or, you know, get into trouble. So they would start being like a bad girl, and then at the end they would have like redemption. And she felt like there was this narrative model And so she applied that to her Instagram, and she like started out being excited, and then she like went into this like phase of running into trouble, and then she like found redemption and got a boyfriend at the end. And it was all fictionalized and very melancholic, but she didn't present it as fiction till it was over. And so here it's like an example that she shows of like a, you know, an image that she photoshopped as part of her feed. And I think the most sort of, the element of it that attracted the most attention is that she pretended that she was getting plastic surgery as part of the performance. Yeah, you know, very much relates to the way in which we all present ourselves in different ways or perform our subjectivities online. Okay. And I wanted also to talk about the word post-internet, which is, I consider it a genre of net art, and it's also considered to be an embarrassing word, but I think it's important to talk through. I think so post-internet is a word that people have been using to talk a lot about the prevalence of internet-related art in the contemporary art world. There's been a lot of popularity, a lot of attention paid to artists who are responding to the net and working with it in their practice, often in painting or sculpture, not at all in the kinds of works I've just shown you. But I think, you know, you've probably gotten the idea already that my understanding of net art is like really very expansive and not defined strictly by medium anyway. So I have no problem calling a painting a work of net art if it feels like it's appropriate. But I think there's been, this is like a joke that somebody made on Twitter. People have gotten really excited about it because of like the kind of, there's a sense that it was trendy for a while. And that created a backlash, of course, because there was a sense that the word was poorly defined, which is true. It's like a very, very empty word. But when people use it, it's like just important to know that what they're talking about is just this sort of moment in which the internet has become such an important theme in contemporary art. And I'm going to sort of like break down a little bit of like how and why that happened, just for like a minute. Because a few years ago, I was working on an article that was sort of about how museums should be taking on the kind of cultural logic of the internet in their practice in 2008. Around that time, I read a book that Whitechapel Gallery in London had published. This is 7 years ago, maybe it was 8 years ago. The book was called A Manual for the 21st Century Art Institution. And so I was like, oh, this sounds like a book for me. That book mentioned the word internet twice in like 250 pages. It was insane. I was like shocked, basically. There was no mention of the web. It was as if the internet to the art world, even 7 years ago, didn't exist in many ways. And that was especially strange because in music and newspaper publishing and so many other facets of life, the culture industry at large had just been completely rewritten by the internet. But the sort of industry of art and the kind of discourse around it had not had that same level of, I think, transformation. So I had this sense of like, I was a little bit stressed out by that. But what's been interesting is that, you know, really in the past 5 years, that's changed drastically for different reasons. Oops, not because of that. This is what I wanted to show you. One of them has been just the increase in using the internet as a place to look at art, and especially the web. And it's amazing how late in history this happened, but the blogs like Contemporary Art Daily, which Contemporary Art Daily started in 2008, actually, and all it does is it posts each day installation shots from a different exhibition around the world. Its readership, kind of in the pre-Instagram moment, became really, really high, and it became like an influential platform where if you had a show, getting it featured on Contemporary Art Daily meant that people would see it, in a sense,